In the 1860s, life expectancy in Liverpool, one of the wealthiest and most modern Victorian cities, was only 26 years old. People weren't dying from wars on distant battlefields. They weren't starving from lack of food. The real danger was hiding somewhere no one ever thought to look. It was inside their own homes. The richer you were, the more dangers surrounded you. Wealthy families faced cholera and typhoid like the poor, but also poison from wallpaper, makeup, clothing, dishes, and indoor air. The very things that made a Victorian home beautiful were the same things that made it deadly. Arsenic-laced wallpaper decorated nurseries where children slept. Lead pipes carried the water families drank every morning. Gas lamps leaked invisible fumes while casting their romantic glow, and the milk delivered fresh each day was often contaminated with chalk and worse. Even the steep, narrow staircases that servants climbed dozens of times daily were death traps waiting to happen. The Victorians believed they were living in the most advanced, most civilized time in history. Their homes were filled with the finest things money could buy. They felt safe and proud, but they didn't know the truth. The beautiful objects they surrounded themselves with were quietly killing them. Every day, in the pursuit of beauty and respectability, they were poisoning themselves and their families without ever realizing it. The 1860s represented the absolute height of Victorian civilization. This was an era of unprecedented confidence and power. The Victorian Empire stretched across the globe, controlling vast territories from India to Africa to the Caribbean. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, governing nearly a quarter of the Earth's population. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the Victorian Empire," wasn't just a boast. It was geographical fact. This global dominance brought enormous wealth flowing into Victorian cities. Raw materials arrived from every corner of the empire: cotton from India, tea from Ceylon, rubber from Malaya, gold from Australia, timber from Canada. These resources fed the massive industrial machine that had been growing since the late 18th century. By the 1860s, Victorian factories were producing more manufactured goods than the rest of the world combined. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the Victorian landscape completely. On cities that had been modest market towns a century earlier were now sprawling industrial centers with populations in the hundreds of thousands. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds, and Sheffield became powerhouses of production, their skylines dominated by factory chimneys that belched black coal smoke day and night. The Victorian nation led the world in iron production, coal mining, textile manufacturing, and engineering. Victorian trains, Victorian ships, and Victorian manufactured goods were exported to every continent. This industrial dominance created something entirely new in human history: a massive, prosperous middle class. For thousands of years, society had been divided into aristocrats who owned land and peasants who worked it. But Victorian industrialization created a third category: people who weren't born into nobility, but who had enough money to live comfortably. Factory owners, merchants, bankers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and successful shopkeepers all belonged to this new middle class. By the 1860s, this group numbered in the millions and was growing rapidly. These newly prosperous families wanted to display their success. They wanted homes that announced their respectability and good taste. They wanted to distance themselves from the working-class neighborhoods where they or their parents might have grown up. Most importantly, they wanted to imitate the lifestyle of the aristocracy. If wealthy nobles lived in homes filled with expensive decorations, fine furnishings, and the latest technologies, then the middle class would do the same. And this created an enormous demand for consumer goods. For the first time in history, ordinary people could afford things that had once been luxuries reserved for the very rich. Mass production made furniture, dishes, decorations, and fashionable clothing available at prices the middle class could manage. An entire industry emerged to serve this new market, producing millions of items designed to make Victorian homes look prosperous and refined. But this rapid industrial growth had a dark side that nobody fully understood. The same factories that produced wealth also produced pollution on a scale never seen before. The same chemical industries that created brilliant dyes and revolutionary new materials were releasing toxic substances into the environment without any regulation or oversight. The same drive for progress and profit that characterized Victorian civilization meant that manufacturers had every incentive to use the cheapest materials and methods regardless of safety. Walking into a prosperous Victorian home in the 1860s meant entering a space that represented the absolute cutting edge of domestic comfort and style. These homes showcased what Victorian industrial civilization could provide. Every room was designed to impress visitors and demonstrate the family's success and refinement. The walls were covered in patterned wallpaper, a relatively recent innovation that had become wildly popular. Before the Industrial Revolution, only the wealthy could afford to decorate their walls with anything beyond plain whitewash or wood panels. But Victorian factories had revolutionized wallpaper production. Your steam-powered printing presses could produce rolls of wallpaper quickly and cheaply. Synthetic dyes created colors more vivid than anything available from natural sources. By the 1860s, even modest middle-class homes had multiple rooms decorated with fashionable wallpaper. The most popular colors were greens and blues. Victorian taste favored rich, deep colors rather than pale pastels. Emerald green, in particular, was extremely fashionable. It appeared in wallpapers, fabrics, artificial flowers, and even children's toys. Women's dresses in brilliant green were the height of fashion. This vibrant green was achieved using copper arsenite, a compound containing arsenic. Arsenic had been known as a poison for centuries. It was used deliberately to kill rats and insects. Victorian murderers occasionally used it to kill human victims, taking advantage of the fact that arsenic poisoning symptoms resembled natural illness. But nobody made the connection between arsenic as a deliberate poison and arsenic as a component of everyday household items. The idea that beautiful wallpaper could be dangerous seemed absurd. The problem was that arsenic in wallpaper wasn't stable. As the paste holding the wallpaper to the wall dried out and cracked, microscopic particles of arsenic-containing dust would be released into the air. When rooms were damp, which was common in the Victorian climate, molds would grow on the wallpaper paste. These molds converted the arsenic into an even more toxic gas called trimethyl arsine. Every time someone brushed against the wall, every time a door slammed creating air movement, more arsenic entered the room's atmosphere. Families living in homes with arsenic wallpaper experienced a range of mysterious health problems. Chronic coughs, headaches, and fatigue were common. Children seemed particularly affected, developing unexplained illnesses that doctors couldn't cure. Skin problems, digestive issues, and general weakness plagued household members. In severe cases, people developed symptoms that clearly indicated poisoning: vomiting, difficulty breathing, and organ damage. Victorian doctors occasionally noticed that patients would improve when they left home for a holiday and worsen when they returned. Some began to suspect that something in the home environment was causing illness. By the 1860s, a few chemists and medical professionals were sounding the alarm about arsenic wallpaper. They published articles, gave lectures, and tried to convince manufacturers and the public that these beautiful decorations were deadly. But they faced enormous resistance. Wallpaper manufacturers insisted their products were perfectly safe. They had financial incentives to deny the problem, as arsenic-based pigments were cheap and produced the most fashionable colors. Many homeowners refused to believe that the walls they had spent good money decorating could be harming their families. Removing and replacing wallpaper was expensive and disruptive. Some Victorian doctors who didn't understand chemistry dismissed the arsenic theory as nonsense. The debate dragged on for decades. Meanwhile, arsenic wallpaper continued to be manufactured and sold. Estimates suggest that by the 1860s, virtually every Victorian home of any social standing contained at least some arsenic-laden decorations. The poison was everywhere, slowly accumulating in the bodies of millions of people who had no idea they were being exposed. Victorian civilization prided itself on technological innovation. The 1860s saw the widespread adoption of conveniences that transformed domestic life. These innovations were celebrated as proof of progress and Victorian ingenuity. But like the wallpaper, many of these modern marvels carried hidden dangers. Gas lighting was perhaps the most significant domestic technology of the era. Before gas, homes were lit by candles or oil lamps, both of which were expensive, produced limited light, and required constant attention. Gas lighting changed everything. Pipes carried coal gas directly into homes, and where it could be lit at fixed lamps throughout the house. With the turn of a valve, a room could be flooded with bright, steady light. The transformation was revolutionary. Gas lighting extended the productive hours of the day. People could read, sew, or work long after sunset. Social gatherings could continue late into the evening. Businesses stayed open longer. The economic and social impact was enormous. By the 1860s, gas lighting was standard in middle-class Victorian homes and was spreading rapidly to working-class neighborhoods. But coal gas was a mixture of hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, and other compounds. It was highly flammable and toxic. The pipes carrying gas throughout Victorian homes were often poorly installed and maintained. Leaks were common. Small leaks filled homes with invisible odorless carbon monoxide, which caused headaches, nausea, and at higher concentrations, death. Larger leaks could lead to explosions that destroyed entire houses. Gas lamps also consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and water vapor. In the airtight Victorian homes designed to keep out drafts and preserve heat, these emissions accumulated to dangerous levels. Victorian homes had no mechanical ventilation. The only air circulation came from occasionally opening windows, which people avoided doing because it let in the cold and the dirty outdoor air. The result was that Victorian homes often had terrible indoor air quality. The combination of gas lamp emissions, coal fire smoke from heating, and the outgassing from arsenic wallpaper created a toxic atmosphere. People breathed this air for hours every day, and chronic respiratory problems were extremely common. Tuberculosis, which spreads more easily in poorly ventilated spaces, was a leading cause of death. Water supply represented another area where Victorian progress created new dangers. In earlier centuries, people drew water from wells, streams, or public fountains. This water wasn't always clean, but at least people understood that water sources could become contaminated and should be chosen carefully. The Victorian solution was to build centralized water systems with pipes delivering water directly to homes. This was genuinely revolutionary. Indoor plumbing transformed domestic life, saving enormous amounts of labor previously spent carrying water. But Victorian water systems were built using lead pipes. Lead was the material of choice because it was soft and easy to work with. It didn't rust, and it could be bent to fit around corners and through walls. Plumbers had used lead for centuries for special applications, but Victorian industrial production made lead pipes cheap enough to install throughout entire water systems. Lead dissolves slowly into water, especially if the water is slightly acidic. Every time someone drank water from a lead pipe system, they consumed small amounts of lead. Lead accumulates in the body over time, building up in bones and organs. Lead poisoning causes a wide range of symptoms: abdominal pain, headaches, irritability, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, and eventually kidney damage, high blood pressure, and neurological problems. In children, even small amounts of lead cause permanent brain damage, reducing intelligence and causing behavioral problems. Victorian doctors had no way to test for lead in the blood. They saw the symptoms, but couldn't identify the cause. Lead poisoning was often mistaken for other illnesses or simply accepted as the normal ailments of life. The connection between lead pipes and declining health wasn't established until the 20th century. By then, generations of Victorians had been exposed to lead throughout their entire lives. The same industrial forces that created Victorian prosperity also transformed the food supply, generally not for the better. The 1860s saw the rise of industrial food production and distribution. Foods that had once been produced locally by people you knew were now manufactured in factories, processed by strangers, and sold through complex supply chains. This created unprecedented opportunities for contamination and adulteration. Food adulteration had existed for centuries, but Victorian industrialization brought it to new levels. The problem was simple. Pure food was expensive, and there was money to be made by substituting cheaper ingredients. In a world without effective government regulation or consumer protection, unscrupulous producers and merchants had every incentive to cheat. Bread, the staple food of Victorian life, was routinely adulterated. Victorian consumers strongly preferred white bread, considering it more refined and civilized than dark bread. Meeting this preference required removing the nutritious parts of wheat and using only the white endosperm. But even this wasn't white enough for Victorian tastes. Bakers added chalk, plaster of Paris, pipe clay, or ground bones to make bread whiter. Some used alum, a chemical compound that made bread appear fresh for days and allowed bakers to use lower quality flour. Alum interfered with digestion and prevented the body from absorbing nutrients properly. Milk was considered the perfect food in Victorian society. Mothers were told it was essential for their children's health and growth. Doctors recommended it for invalids recovering from illness. Everyone from infants to the elderly consumed milk daily, believing it to be pure, wholesome, and nourishing. The reality could not have been more different. Victorian milk was one of the most dangerous substances regularly consumed by the population. The problem began with where the milk came from. In an era before transportation could move fresh milk quickly from rural farms to city centers, most Victorian city dwellers got their milk from urban dairies located right in the middle of dense neighborhoods. These were not the pastoral farms people imagined. They were cramped, filthy operations where dozens or even hundreds of cows lived in dark, poorly ventilated buildings, often standing in their own waste. Many of these urban dairies were deliberately located next to breweries and distilleries. This wasn't coincidence, it was business strategy. Breweries produced massive amounts of spent grain as waste after making beer. This hot fermenting mash was fed to the dairy cows because it was free and seemed to make cows produce more milk. But this unnatural diet made the animals sick. The cows developed a condition called brewery cow disease, becoming thin and weak, their milk thin and bluish rather than rich and white. Some cows became so ill they had to be held upright by slings just to be milked. The milk from these diseased cows was already of terrible quality, but the real danger came from what happened to it next. There was no refrigeration in the 1860s. Milk began to spoil within hours, especially in warm weather. For milk sellers, this created a serious problem. Spoiled milk couldn't be sold, which meant lost profits. Their solution was to disguise the spoilage through a series of chemical additions that transformed milk into a toxic cocktail. Water was the first and most common adulterant. Adding water to milk increased the volume that could be sold from a given supply of milk. Some sellers added so much water that milk became half water or more. But watered milk looked wrong. It was thin and had a bluish tint that customers recognized as a sign of poor quality. To fix this, sellers added chalk, plaster of Paris, or even ground-up limestone to restore the white color. These substances made the milk look thick and white again, hiding the fact that much of what customers were buying was simply water mixed with chemicals. The texture was still wrong, though. Real milk has a creamy richness that watered milk lacks. To simulate this quality, some unscrupulous milk sellers added truly horrifying ingredients. Animal brains, mashed and mixed into the milk, created an appearance of creaminess. Starch was sometimes used for the same purpose. These additives had no nutritional value and introduced additional contamination, but they allowed sellers to pass off heavily adulterated milk as genuine. Milk naturally sours as bacteria multiply in it. This souring produces a distinctive smell and taste that even Victorian consumers would recognize and reject. To prevent this obvious sign of spoilage, sellers added preservatives. Formaldehyde was a favorite choice. This is the same chemical used to preserve dead bodies and biological specimens. It prevented bacterial growth and kept milk from smelling sour for days. Consumers had no idea they were drinking embalming fluid mixed into their children's milk. Beyond the deliberate adulterations, Victorian milk carried invisible biological dangers that were even more deadly. The cows producing the milk often suffered from bovine tuberculosis, a disease that could be transmitted to humans through milk. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in Victorian society, and contaminated milk was a major transmission route. Scarlet fever, typhoid, and diphtheria could all spread through milk if the cows were infected or if the milk was handled by infected workers. The bacteria in unpasteurized milk multiplied rapidly in the warm conditions and unsanitary handling practices common in Victorian dairies. Milk was transported in open containers through dirty streets. It was ladled from one container to another, using unwashed scoops. Flies landed on it. Dust and debris fell into it. By the time milk reached consumers' homes, it was often teeming with bacteria. The impact on children was devastating. Infant mortality rates in Victorian cities were shockingly high. In Liverpool, Manchester, and other industrial centres, 40 to 50% of children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Parents accepted this horrific death toll as normal, even inevitable. They had no concept that something as basic and seemingly wholesome as milk could be killing their children. Victorian doctors saw endless cases of children suffering from unexplained fevers, digestive problems, and wasting diseases. They prescribed various treatments based on the medical theories of the time, but nothing seemed to work because they were treating symptoms without understanding the cause. The medical community was divided between those who still believed in miasma theory, the idea that diseases came from bad air, and those beginning to understand germ theory. Neither group had made the connection between milk and the epidemic of childhood deaths. Meanwhile, the poisoning continued. Victorian families, none believing they were nourishing themselves and their children, were instead consuming toxic chemicals and disease-causing contaminants with nearly every meal. The beautiful Victorian homes, with their fashionable decorations and modern conveniences, contained dining tables laden with poisoned food. Progress and poison had become inseparable.